Let's return to This Week in America. Here's your host, Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody. Coast to Coast, This Week in America. Areulia Davis is a former Chicago public school teacher, known as an educator's educator, teaching for 31 years, retiring in 2012. Pursuing her passion for African American history and Chicago history, she decided to write and publish 2 books, a third one to be released spring of this year. She's the author of A New Land, Book 1, about a family post-slavery. This family becomes a part of the African American Great Migration to the Midwest. John David's family's dream is to move to Chicago, but the pressures of being a sharecropper places stumbling blocks in the way, forcing the family to slip away in the middle of the night. The story includes paranormal and murder, but most of all, the spirit of a family trying to escape the face of the South. Areulia serves as an educational leader for the neighborhood where she grew up in North Lawndale, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. The author of A New Land, Book 1, a touching and powerful story of survival, sacrifice, and the enduring strength of love, Areulia Davis, our guest on This Week in America. Areulia, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, Rick, I am so grateful for this and just pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome, and a pleasure to have you here. So much to talk about in the book, and we'll talk about the 2 books that are out, the third that'll be coming out shortly. I want to talk to begin here about your illustrious teaching career. And as I understand, you always wanted to be a teacher. You said, for as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a teacher. Talk about where that came from and the career that you had in teaching.
Okay, well, I remember when I was my passion to be a teacher started when I was in kindergarten, and I had a teacher, and her name was Miss Fortuneberry. I don't know where it came from, but that was really her name. And she was just a loving person. She worked with the kindergartners on stage, and it was just a fantastic year being a kindergartner. And then as I started to go through the other grades, first grade all the way up through high school, each year was more pleasurable. In other words, I really enjoyed being in the classroom, and I admired every teacher. A lot of the teachers, I did remember their names. Well, as I gotten older, I forgot some. But a lot of teachers basically made a very, very good impact in my life. And there was also the influence of my aunts. I had 2 aunts, my mother's sisters. They were teachers also. So I saw education and being an educator as one of the things that I definitely wanted to do when I grew up. They always ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? I always said a teacher. And so that's what ended up happening with me.
Well, it's interesting the impact Mrs. Fortuneberry had on you. You talk about the fact that she would start each day with a smile and a handshake. And it's something you sort of take for granted. A child that age, all of a sudden, here's this figure outside of my family. There's a little intimidation probably going into that. You've got a smile, you've got a handshake every day. And the bright spot you said was our morning circle. Talk about that. And I love the way she had such a welcoming approach to her classroom.
Well, her base at that time, back in those days, there was not a lot of pressure on the state level for teachers to produce very good scores, as far as their students. But basically the learning impact as far as the classroom being home away from home. Teachers were very nurturing in those days. And I'm not saying that they're nurturing these days, but at that time, a teacher could easily place, greet you at the door. They could easily place a hand on your shoulder, assuring you that you were going to have a fantastic day. And then she would sit. Now, at that time, teachers were encouraged to learn how to play the piano. So most of the classrooms in the Chicago public schools had pianos. And a lot of the teachers, especially the ones in kindergarten through 3rd grade, were pianists. They knew how to play the pianos. They got you involved in the songs and so forth. So that just basically started a child's day out in the right manner, which allowed us to be very comfortable in the classroom. And so it just went on from there. And so I was impressed. impressed. I was impressed as a 5-year-old, and I just took it from there. And Miss Fortune Berry took every opportunity to teach us. So instead of following like a direct lesson plan, the lesson plans were guides. And this is something I've practiced also when I was teaching, but the lesson plans were guides. But if the conversation of a lesson went in a different direction, in other words, Miss Fortune Berry, why are the lights, why is the stoplight red and the stoplight green and so on and so forth, she would take that into a new level of learning. And so we just basically learned everything that was happening in the world. We did field trips, and our field trips was basically around the neighborhood. We didn't necessarily have to get on a bus and go to the zoo. We were basically in the neighborhood, picking up leaves and flowers and looking at houses and things like that in the neighborhood where I grew up. So it was very, very promising learning experience for me.
She made an impression on you as a student and as a person, continued what she was doing in education, teaching in Chicago for 31 years and continuing in education today. Talk about that first job that you had. You're a student yourself, and you're working with children, and the impact that had on you, and that just further encouraged you to get into education, didn't it?
Yes. Well, we would have what's called a work study, or either summer programs or summer job programs in Chicago. And what was happening is that students that were already in school were encouraged to go into schools and work. And so I remembered my first summer job. I was at a school, and I was assisting, it was a summer school, and so I was assisting the teacher to catch up, to help these particular students catch up with like assignments, or either broaden their skills in reading and in math, because back in the day, that was the important core subjects, reading and math. And so those particular jobs, so every job I had growing up as a teenager was basically working with children. And that just sort of gave me the straightforwardness that this was what I was supposed to be. And so before I turned around and ended up with the actual classroom, I also worked at Malcolm X College in the Child Development Center. And there I was teachers people that wanted to become child development majors, they would come down and observe me in the classroom. So every job, everything always had something to do with children. I was never, ever behind a desk with a typewriter. I was always working with children, even some children that had special needs. I worked in that area. And then I was also a field manager for Girl Scouts of Chicago. So here I'm back again, working with young people. So everything has just sort of drawn me to the level where I want to work with children. I feel it is very important because sometimes their parents are not able to give them what they need, but basically that educator or that community worker or that volunteer can give them, fill in the gaps of what sometimes our children need.
I'm so impressed with the career that you have in education, retired as a teacher, but you continue with that. And I want to shift in a second and talk about the book, because that's a continuation of this. You're giving us a story, not just for students, but for adults to really enjoy and get into the minds of what people were going through during this era of American history. The book is A New Land, Book 1 by Areulia Davis. Areulia Davis, yes. That's Areulia. Her website, yes. davisaurelia.com, and I'll give you all of that in the links on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Talk about, first of all, the history. What made you so interested in the history of basically any kind, because it's just not this time period, but history in general? Why that fascination? Why that passion in history?
Okay, well, when I did start teaching, I was teaching third grade. And our unit for third grade, history unit for social studies unit for third grade was Chicago. How perfect is that? Chicago. And so throughout the year, I worked along with my other colleague who was also a third grade teacher, and she was stronger in the sciences. and I was stronger in the histories and social studies. So I would teach my students about Chicago. We would cover the Chicago flag, we would cover the Chicago seal, and then just go through all the history of Chicago, the Potawatomi Indians, DuSable landing in Chicago, and just different things within Chicago. But what made it even more so, where I was living in North Lawndale, what made it even more so interesting is that particular area was at one time a Jewish area. And as African Americans migrated to Chicago, a lot of those African Americans settled in North Lawndale. So the house that I lived in, we noticed, I was down in the basement one time, and it's part of the third book, down in the basement, and behind a wall, I saw a music roll or piano roll. And so I started just going into the libraries and just looking up information about North Lawndale. And it was just so very interesting as to the different entertainers that lived in Lawndale, the park called the Douglas Park, and how basically in the field house, they built boats to go out onto the lagoon. And then Lawndale is also very famous for all of the gravestone buildings that are living in there, the two flat buildings that are in North Lawndale. And presently, the house where my husband stays right now, we found out that particular house was a Jewish synagogue. And so in the meantime, just being in a neighborhood that had so much historic value, I was always just reaching out and just trying to see exactly what more I can find out. And I just took in other words, it was ongoing. So I still don't know everything I need to know. But I took what I did know and just started relishing it. So I find myself on the internet even looking at individuals that were born in the 20s and the 30s and so on and so forth. And of course, even going back to African American history, I was born in 1952. So I was during the civil rights era, and knew about Rosa Parks and so on and so forth. So that has just been a passion of mine, African American history, but at the same time, American history as to how all of this came together to give us what we have today as far as history is concerned.
It's amazing, and you do a wonderful job. The two books that are out, and we'll talk about book one here in a second, touch on book two, and then book three, which Areulia talked about, is going to be based on her recollections, the neighborhood, a work in progress, and I'm looking forward to chatting about that here in a few minutes. But let's focus on book one, A New Land. This is the story about a family post-slavery. And interesting time for so many people. The Civil War is over, and we think life went on, and there was a lot going on in the world of post-slavery. Talk about that and the family that you focus on and what they went through during this period.
Well, it starts out, let's put it this way. I was going to do the third book first. That's what was supposed to happen. And so I started working on the third book, but at the same time, I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, people need to know exactly where this came from.
Yes.
So I went all the way back. And the book itself is basically just giving a little bit of African American history. A lot of the slaves that were brought into the United States were gifted with different skills. There were carpenters, there were architects, there were engineers, mathematicians. And as we go through American history and African American history, you know about all of the inventors that came through slavery, that were slaves or either African Americans that have invented a lot of things, multiple things within the United States.
Yes.
And so along with those engineers and mathematicians, I do believe and feel that these African Americans and these slaves had a lot of gifts. Gifts of foresight, being able to see into the future, being able to tell where they came from, and being able to foresight as far as seeing, healing, all of those skills. And so that being a part of my mantra, to the point where I wanted to basically get more into it and find out more into it, I incorporated that in the first book. And so in the first book, what ends up happening is that there's three generations, and that third generation is John David, and he basically breaks away. It's post-slavery. He breaks away from his mother, but when he looks back on the cabin where he grew up, it all of a sudden it's disappeared. So that just I put that in there, and then I said, oh my goodness, that's good. And so I've created these paranormal things that basically I am intrigued by also, and it just carries it. And so it gets to the point. Book one sort of ends with John David marrying and having 2 children, and that's what his mother told him was going to happen before she passed away. But even before his mother told him about it, his grandmother told his mother about it. And so the generations of information is just being passed down from person to person to person. Now, the unfortunate thing, even though slaves were considered free, and we talk about Juneteenth and all of those things, a lot of them did not leave the South. And a lot of them stayed on the plantations because they basically didn't know anything beyond the plantation.
Yes.
And they worked as sharecroppers. But we found out that sharecropping was another form of slavery, because what would end up happening is that as a sharecropper would pay the former plantation owner to make, do things and whatever, they always had a tendency of getting behind in their payments to the plantation owner. So unfortunately, John David just decided that it was time for his family to leave, and he was going to venture up to Chicago, which is sometimes the first place that African Americans landed. Union Station. They would take that train and land in Union Station in Chicago, and from there they would go on. But John David sent his family forward, and he had to stay behind because as they were slipping away, just like the Underground Railroad, as they were slipping away at night, they got caught. And so he said he hid his wife and his 2 children, but he stayed there, and they took him back to the plantation where he was working. And unfortunately, he lost his life, and the owner lost his life. But his wife and his 2 children ventured on to Chicago. His wife may live, still trying to figure out what happened to her husband. And even in a special part in the second book, she went back trying to trail and face what happened to her husband, but she never returned. And so this leaves only the 2 children, Olivia and her brother. And that's where the second book ends. So it talks about them living in Chicago. It brings up history to the point where we're even talking about how when people landed in Chicago, migrated to Chicago or to other cities, that they had rooming houses. So you were basically in these large buildings, but everybody basically shared one bathroom. And the apartment they landed in may have had a bedroom and a kitchen or a kitchenette, but they never did have their own bathroom. So they had to basically live within a communal type of situation. And it was not always pleasant, but at the same time, they realized that it was better than where they had come from, where during the South, there was still Jim Crow laws, and people and African Americans were still being lynched for different things and so on and so forth, So that's what takes them. So they're living through the 20s and the 30s in Chicago and basically trying to survive as the children of John David.
It's such a fascinating read. It's very emotional at a number of levels, a number of themes that you talk about. When you read the reviews of the first book, A New Land, book 1 by Areulia Davis, Areulia Davis. Her website is davisaurelia.com. We'll get that. You can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Book, of course, available. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, litprime.com, all of the usual places, and all that information, again, on our website. As you go through that, they really appreciate the dialogue. And I'm thinking as you do the dialogue, you really mentally have to get into these characters, don't you? What was it like putting yourselves in the position of May Lynn and John Jr. and Olivia? What was it like? I would think that would be very emotional for you to emotionally go back to this period in history.
Well, you know what? I'm coming from a family. My mom lived to be 84, and I'm currently working with her, caregiving for her baby sister who's 90. And then she had another sister that passed in July who was 94. So you see, longevity runs in my family.
Oh, yes.
And so in the meantime, what also happens is that we used to sit down with these are my mother's aunts. My mother's sisters, and we used to sit down with them, and they would just tell us the stories about what it was like living in Chicago back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. I remember my mom telling me how she was very religious, and so she would go to conventions, and she would take trains all the way from Chicago to California. You're talking about Route 66 and so on and so forth.
Oh, yes.
And at the same time, my mom and her, there was 5 siblings. Unfortunately, my grandmother, who is my mom's mother, passed away when my mother was about 12 years old. So my mom had to take care of her siblings. She was the oldest, and she had to take care of her siblings, which included 3 sisters and 1 brother. And then what ended up happening, my grandfather, during that time, he basically went around collecting rags. He collected rags and he just did all kinds of things and whatever. So this was a typical African-American family coming through this time trying to survive through the Depression and so on and so forth, trying to survive. But at the same time, what ended up happening is that I sort of realized that basically my particular family growing up, we did not necessarily have all of the funds and the money that we want. I came from a family of 5. It was 5 girls, my mom and my dad. My dad was a barber, and my mom was just did regular work. She worked at the post office and so on and so forth. Yes. So we're talking about a family that did not necessarily have everything they needed, but we were okay. We were okay. There was not a big car sitting in front of the house. And basically, my father would dole out our lunch money, about 25 cents a day. And my mom would fix dinner for us, and we would have a home-cooked meal every day. It wasn't necessarily steak, not always chicken, but sometimes the way we would eat and what we would eat, but we survived as a family. And family was strong. So that's when I was writing the characters of this particular book. I wanted to make sure that this particular family was strong, but I wanted them also to feel and feed off of their ancestors. I wanted them to, even though their mother was not there, I wanted them to be able to feed off of what their mom might do or what their father did and whatever. They never did see their father again. But at the same time, the emotional part of it, I placed myself in those situations because I grew up in the 50s. I grew up during civil rights era. So I knew exactly what it looked like. I knew what it felt like. And even before civil rights started and got stronger, I can realize and understand what was happening. I don't mind telling you this. I started college. I was the first one in my house, in my family, to go to college. And I started out at a junior college. But basically, there were rules in place in Chicago where you basically, you only rode the bus so far. And then you had to get out because you were not going to go through a particular neighborhood in Chicago. So we're talking about the roadblocks. Even though African Americans migrated up, to Chicago, there were still roadblocks that kept them from being full citizens. So what they did is they took what they had and just tried to make it do. My mom, that's favorite, make it do.
Well, and you've done that so well, and the books bring this to life. The first book is A New Land, Book 1. The second book that's available now, John David's Legacy, and we'll talk about the book number 3 here shortly. The authors are guest Areulia Davis, Areulia Davis, book available wherever books are sold. Both books are there. And her website, davisareulia.com. We've got that on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. So it's such a fascinating life that you've led. I want to go back and spend a mention talking about continuing working in education, an educational advocate for the neighborhood that you mentioned where you grew up in North Lawndale. Talk about neighborhood, why that's so important, and why you continue to this day. And I mentioned you retired in 2012. Obviously, a very early retirement for you because you're out there with the passion, the enthusiasm, the advocacy, and working for people right now. Talk about why this role, like educational advocate in the old neighborhood, is so important to you and why you feel so strongly about it.
It's important to me because the neighborhood where I grew up, I attended school in my neighborhood. I attended elementary school, I attended Upper Grade Center, and I went to high school. I can really realistically say there's only one alma mater left, and that's Upper Grade Center. The other schools, the neighborhood became so empty as far as students were concerned. what ended up happening is that the neighborhood where I grew up and attended school, at that particular time, basically children lived in the neighborhood. They attended school in the neighborhood where they lived. They attended school in the neighborhood where they lived. And then over a period of time, I would say basically after Dr. King's death, the neighborhood started disappearing as far as the students were concerned. And a lot of resources was not put back into the neighborhood. So you're looking at a school that might hold as many as 600 children, but at this time in 2023 or 2022, we're only looking at maybe 150. So we're talking about schools that are not filled to capacity. And that's because a lot of our children were exiting out of the neighborhood to go to other schools, meaning that almost giving the message that the schools they were attending or living with had in their neighborhood did not have the necessary resources in order for them to be able to just go forward. And so I hooked up with the Community Action Council in North Lawndale back in, I would say, it was about 7 years ago. And after retirement, and I just wanted to basically give back to what I had when I lived in this particular community. I wanted to give back. And so what we did is we were destined to bring those schools that we attended back to the neighborhood where the children lived. And so we have successfully been able to but basically take 3 existing schools and take them, turn them into STEAM schools. And if we're talking about the science, technology, engineering, and math, but we added the arts component also. And what's happening now is that we are taking those particular schools, and we have 2 elementary schools, preschool through 8th grade, and they're going to be feeding into one particular high school.
Interesting.
They're two elementary schools that for children living in a neighborhood going to feed into the high school for the neighborhood. So all of these children basically can, instead of getting up at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning and their parents taking them across the city to a school, they can now attend a school that's maybe about a block away.
That's amazing.
And get the same resources that everybody else has.
And this could be a lesson for so many communities around the country that have gone through the same situation that you have. Time is going by so quickly. Several thoughts, and you mentioned arts. You take STEM and you put the A in there for arts. I know when you began as a teenager working with the young people in Chicago during the summer, that arts and crafts was something that you taught. So often we don't hold arts up there at the same level as the others in STEM. Talk about that, the importance of art and why that's so important to be able to teach, and for young people and old people as well to appreciate the arts.
Well, I have always given myself the artsy crafty thing. I love to do arts and crafts. And the interesting thing is that a lot of our children have the skills, but they need that individual to be able to pull the skills out of them.
Yes.
And so as with the high school that we're talking about, I am just so impressed with this particular high school because the art department in this particular high school is just pulling anything and everything out. But at the same time, if we're looking at the children, these technology kids, I'm calling them technology kids, so many of them have the skills of making movies and drawing and producing and whatever. And the good thing about it is that Center Space is in the North Lawndale neighborhood, and quite a few television shows, Chicago PD, Chicago Med, Chicago Fire. Those are movies that are produced within the North Lawndale area. The TV series are produced in North Lawndale. And so in the meantime, if these particular things are happening, why not pull the children in to learn these skills?
Ah, yes.
And so in the meantime, instead of them going, and not saying all children are not college ready. And so we have to start looking at this. Some of them are a little smarter than the college because they're a lot smarter than me as far as technology is concerned. But just starting to teach them now how to get behind that camera and do and produce a movie and videos and things like that. So these particular schools are starting to teach preschoolers at the preschool level. And when you walk around and you go into a store and you see a toddler with a phone in his hand, you know it's
exactly. Yes.
And the gifts are already there. You just have to point them in and make them alive, So that's what we're trying to do. So we started from preschool to 12th grade, and just some of these children that live in North Lawndale will have the opportunity. They may have their careers in place even before. They may have their careers in place even before they graduate.
That's just amazing.
Before they graduate, and that's a plus. That's a plus,
That is a plus, and everybody wins in that particular case. And it's a continuation.
It does, including the families. Yes, definitely.
A continuation of what you're doing. Areulia Davis, our guest on the program, author of A New Land, Book 1, also John David's Legacy. We'll talk about Book 3 here in the second time. It's going by so quickly. But you said, and I think this is so interesting, I quickly discovered that each child had a very unique way of learning based on their environment. Talk about just briefly, but I thought that was so important. Unique. Sometimes we tend to group everybody together, and maybe we try to teach all the same way. Even children from a family may have unique ways of learning. Talk about that and understanding where each child comes from, and that impacts you as a teacher and how you're able to relate and teach that student.
Well, for the time that I was teaching, I came from a school, educational facility college for teachers, and we were basically just sort of geared toward one direction. You put lump everybody in the whole group.
Yes.
After retiring, then as I went through my so many years of teaching and being an educator, I said, my goodness, I may have 25 in front of me, and I have 25 different learners in front of me. And so as education evolved in like the late 90s and going into the 2000s, people and educators knew that they had to start teaching children according to their learning styles, according to their learning gifts. What kind of learners did you have in front? Some were auditory learners, some were hands-on, and just different things like that. And so an educator coming through now, or having came through the 2000s and late 90s, they started putting their classrooms together according to how best the child could learn. And so what ended up happening is that before I retired, I would have at least 5 to 6 different groups in my classroom. And what I would do is that I would not pigeonhole that particular child. In other words, the auditory learners, I wouldn't just put them in a group by themselves and leave them there. But what I would do is also take those ones that were learned through listening. I would take them and put them in a group that was hands-on. Learning the same subject,
yes,
but they basically were doing hands-on. And so what it does is that even though a child I just want to listen to the story. But in the meantime, I want you to listen to it, but what else can you do with the story that's outside of listening? And so I built up in my classrooms those type of children who were able to just have at least 2 different gifts of learning. In other words, I'm not, Miss Davis, I know how to put this together. I can listen to the story and I can draw a picture listening to the story. So that makes them hands-on. And I can build a machine that's happening in the story. And so children, if you're not pulling that out of them, they have a tendency of just going down one road and staying down that one road.
Yes.
And unfortunately, they get to the end of the road and they have run out of ideas and they don't know what to do next. So basically classrooms now, a good classroom that if you were to attend a regular school, public school or whatever, you would see groups going on and you would see different things happening in the groups. So a teacher is being more now like a facilitator and directing those groups within the classroom, still being able to manage what's going on, but sort of guiding the children through their learning paths as to, and showing them the strengths that they really do have.
What is it like as a teacher when you see a child, you mentioned 25, maybe 25 different children, you see them engage in what you're teaching, what you are working with them on. You see the motivation there where it's fun for them to come into the classroom. They probably can't wait to come back in to see you tomorrow for what's going to happen next. What is it like when you see a child really engage and you're thinking, I believe I've really tapped into something that's going to be lifelong for this student? You
know what? I after a while, I looked at myself I mentor teachers now. I do talk to teachers that are still in the classroom. And Rick, I don't mind telling you, I want to mentor them so they'll recruit me back. So, but anyway, I don't have a problem sharing. I have told teachers in the past, I said, you have maybe 30 students, 28 to 27 students. Wherever they come in at, that's where you have to meet them. Where, whatever skill levels they come into the classroom, that's where you have to meet them, where their skill level. And that's where you start. That's where you start. Because you have third graders, that doesn't mean that every child coming into that classroom is a good third grader or ready to learn third grade skills. You still might have some children that are reading on the first grade level. You may have some children that are reading on the second grade level. May have some children that haven't even learned their math facts. And so you have to meet each child definitely by where they are. And that's where you start. I have also, after a while, I say about the first 5 years of teaching, I did struggle quite a bit. But after the 6th year, I devised a plan, and I was under such good administrators that they allowed me to do this. I developed what I needed to know. I developed what I needed to do in my classroom. And even though there were so many other things around me, my classroom was unique because basically the family that I had gotten that September is the family that I was going to have till June. And I started looking and assessing my children early on, and I found out the ones that were good in math. I found out the ones that were having issues with reading, sight words, and different things like that. And so what I would do is I would develop groups. And they talk about cooperative grouping and all of those things. And basically, my groups were a little different because what I would do is I would give the whole class one particular lesson, but then I would take the groups and find out exactly how much of that lesson they were able to obtain or learn about. And so what would end up happening is that when the final score came down, I'm going to be honest, I was proud of myself. I was able to produce some very good learners to the point where even if they never did get to the grade level of third grade, they did go up some.
Yes.
They did go up some because so many things, happened between kindergarten and second grade. I could not make that up in 1 year. I could not make it up in 1 year.
Yes.
But as long as every child in my classroom improved some, I was satisfied with what I was able to do. I was satisfied, and that's what made me stay on. I didn't get into a panic mode. Oh, I didn't meet the scores. I didn't do that. I gave myself credit every opportunity I could. And because I had such good administrators that backed me up 150%, I was able to stay there 31 years.
That's what an amazing career, and it continues. The value of a good teacher, the value of a good administrator, as Areulia just talked about, it's so important, and we tend to take maybe teachers for granted that, they teach from some textbook, they read that, and they go home at the end of the day.
Yes,
a good teacher does so much, and I can think back in some excellent teachers that I had decades ago, and that influenced my life, and you've touched so many people during the course of your lifetime. Let's talk about the books now. A New Land, Book 1. That book's available, as well as the follow-up book, John David's Legacy. Now, both those available at Amazon, at Lit Prime, at Barnes & Noble, all of the usual places. Also, Aurelia's website, which is davisaurelia.com. I'll spell that here in a second. Book 3, I mentioned that's going to be out soon. Talk about how that's coming and when that will be available.
Okay, like I told you from the beginning, that's the book I started working on first.
Yeah, that should have been book 1. It didn't work out that way. When will that be available?
Okay, so I started working on that book first because I wanted to tell the story about me as a little girl living in North Lawndale.
Yes. That's
what I wanted to do. And so, but like I said before, I had to start up from the beginning. And that's how we came up with book 1, The New Land. And then it didn't go further enough, so I did put in book 2, John David's Legacy. Well, the story, John David's Legacy ends with John David's daughter wondering what happened to her brother. And the house where her brother disappeared was owned by a gentleman that was recruiting African-American men back to the South to work as sharecroppers. And unfortunately, her brother found out what was going on, and unfortunately he lost his life, but she never did understand what happened to him. Well, we're looking at 19, I think we moved into this particular house, the house I'm talking about.
Yes.
we moved into this particular house, I think in like the 50s or 55 or something. That particular neighborhood turned African American in like the early 50s. And talking about full of families and block. I mean, Rick, we were to the point where basically it took a village. Oh my goodness, if we did something during the day that we were not supposed to do, my mom knew about it before we got home. So that's just how strong.
Yes.
That's just how strong the neighborhood was, you know. So Ophelia, which is my middle name, is now connecting with this young lady in the park, and she's starting to see visions. She went into the same house where John David Jr. disappeared, and she's starting to see things within the walls of the basement where everything happened, and so on and so forth. And as she's going along, Olivia is connecting with Ophelia to find out exactly what happened to her brother. So that's how this book is going to end. And I do bring in my adventures of attending the school on the corner and going to social center and learning square dancing and going to my church that's still in my neighborhood. I go to my church every Sunday that's still in North Lawndale, and just basically going through elementary school, through high school. But basically, as Ophelia is going through these things in her life, Olivia is still with her, and just responding to her and letting her know, I need you to help me solve this mystery. What happened to my brother?
That will be
and I'm going to ask you, I don't know what happened to him either. Make that up, but it's going to be a mystery to me, but it's going to be a surprise to me too as to how I
That's
end
interesting.
The
The reader will be surprised. The author was surprised, so why not the reader be surprised as well? You can follow the progress of that when it's available by going to Aurelia's website. That's Aurelia.com. Aurelia is Areulia. Go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and there is a link there, a link that will take you to Amazon, the page there. Take you to litprime.com as well. And I thank litprime.com for arranging our conversation with Areulia today.
Oh, I do too.
Lit Prime Solutions.
Fantastic.
Well, they're helping authors like Areulia publish, distribute, and market their books. The website, litprime.com. Aurelia, the time has gone by way too quickly. Would love to do this again. So much more to talk about. What a career, and a career that's not over. It's continuing to touch lives in a positive way. And it's been such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time, and can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much, Rick. This has been a pleasure. This has been the height of my whole week. So I'm looking for the links and everything, and I'm going to share it with everybody because nobody's going to believe I did this.
Well, we will share it with the world as
family members.
We will share it with the world as well, and proudly we will do so. A New Land, Book 1, is the book specifically we talked about today, but the other books in the series are available as well. John David's Legacy, and soon Book 3 in the series, parentheses 1. That book will be available as well. Areulia Davis is our guest. Our website, davisaurelia.com. Link on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. You're listening to This Week in America. We have more on today's program right after these messages.
This Week in America is online. You can visit our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Scott Pinkerton, associate producer of This Week in America. Jay Anderson, segment producer. Ben Watson, webmaster. Otto Bechet, director of engineering and TV production. This Week in America produced and is a trademark of Blue Funk Broadcasting, LLC. For information on all of our guests and to listen to this week's show, our website again at thisweekinamerica.us. And I'm Sean Bratton, executive producer of This Week in America.